In the latter half of the 20th century, many of the peoples of South America came to experience the brutal rule of military dictatorships. From the Alfredo Stroessner regime in Paraguay to the national reorganization process in Argentina, torture and political repression became a common tool of these regimes. The South American giant of Brazil was no exception, and fell victim to a military rule that lasted for over 20 years. Despite the repression, many political groups fought for liberation, much like the subject of today's video. But unlike these groups, this one individual was not a guerrilla fighter, but a fashion designer, drawn to the fight through the personal tragedy of the disappearance of her son, and who used her influence on the Brazilian and world stage to challenge this formidable enemy. Today we look at the courageous story of Zuzu Angel, and why she was discreetly assassinated by the Brazilian dictatorship. Born Zuleika de Souza Neto in southeastern Brazil. As an adult she moved to Rio de Janeiro and married the American Norman Angel Jones, being known from that point forward as Zuzu Angel. She had a steady rise from humble origins in fashion. Eventually, after years of working as a seamstress, in her mid-40s she embarked on the most sparkling and productive years of her career. In the colourful world of the 1960s, her vibrant designs brought attention and amplified a Brazilian style on the world stage. She became the first designer ever from Brazil to export fashion to the US, and back home, even the First Lady of Brazil had become one of her clients. As her career continued to rise to unprecedented heights, in 1969, the Brazilian Council of Women honoured Zuzu as the Woman of the Year, and by 1970 she was very well established in the US market, clothing many of the day's top film stars such as Kim Novak and Liza Minnelli. However, amidst her success, all around her the Brazil that she had known and grown up in had now entered into the depths of a truly dark part of its history. Since 1964, Brazil had been ruled by a hardline military dictatorship. Having overthrown left-wing President João Goulart in that year, this anti-communist dictatorship would last for over 20 years, and in many ways was fairly similar to the other South American military dictatorships of that era. All of these regimes were backed by the United States, fresh from the memory of the early 1960s, which had witnessed some of the most tense and dangerous years of the entire Cold War era. Her unlikely collision course with this government stemmed from one reason: her son Stuart. Stuart Angel was a young activist and member of the revolutionary leftist group MR8. Stuart's guerrilla activity with this group led to him organising logistics for them by 1969, the same year that the group kidnapped and briefly held the American ambassador to Brazil, Charles Burke Elbrick. They eventually released Charles in exchange for the release of 15 political prisoners held by the military regime. Both the kidnapping and Stuart's position within the group made him a target for the security forces, and as mother reached the zenith of her career, son became hunted. Having gradually become an increasingly large target for the regime, on May 14, 1971, Stuart Angel was arrested by the Brazilian security forces. Very soon afterwards, his mother Zuzu received an anonymous phone call detailing Stuart's arrest, and immediately enlisted the support of prominent lawyer Helena Fragoso in anticipation of the likely battles that lie ahead. It was at this very moment that the 5-year ordeal of a mother's worst nightmare would begin. Caught up in a whirlwind of panic, by June she was already in contact with the American government to try and seek answers, but these sadly would not be forthcoming. Via the American consul, Stuart's uncle in the US had discovered an arrest record for a Stuart Edgar Angel Gomez, who had supposedly escaped with his whereabouts unknown. This was likely a misspelling of the surname Jones, almost certainly meaning that this was the proof of arrest that the family had been looking for. But much more horrifying for them was the police's claim that he had escaped captivity. This was usually a sign that a political prisoner had died under interrogation. Zuzu and Fragoso pressed for answers and had a letter proving Stuart's arrest, but all government authorities continued to deny knowledge that this had happened, or simply claimed that he hadn't been arrested altogether. Soon after Stuart's disappearance, his family even filed a case with the Brazilian Human Rights Commission, but this case was discussed and dismissed by April of 1972. Also in 1972 came a revelation that Zuzu had been dreading. Political prisoner Alex Pilari de Alverga sent a letter to her that proved to be the breakthrough in the knowledge of what happened to Stuart. Polari had shared a cell wall with him and described firsthand the horrors to which he had fallen victim. Polari's testimony claimed that Stuart had been brutally tortured, specifically that his mouth had been glued to the exhaust pipe of a jeep that had then been driven through the internal courtyard of the Gradual airbase. Poisoned by the fumes and cut up by the terrain, Stuart was dead within hours. In fact, it was likely that he had been murdered by the end of May 1971, the same month that he'd been arrested. The final insult from the security forces to his suffering mother and family was the rumour that his body had supposedly been disposed of at sea, matching the fate of other political prisoners who were killed at Gradual. From the realms of despair, Zuzu wrote, "Now I have to enter politics and become a militant. To what end? To find my son, and after, the sons of others." She became part of the same struggle that had claimed the life of Stuart, and her vocal opposition to the regime was now truly set to begin. Using her considerable influence, she held the world's first political protest fashion show against the tortures in Brazil undertaken by the dictatorship. On a New York to Rio flight, she seized a flight attendant's microphone and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are arriving in the marvellous city, the land of torture, where my beloved son Stuart Angel was assassinated in the facilities of the Brazilian Air Force." Meanwhile, she also continued to try and leverage her American connections through Stuart's father's side of the family. The US State Department reportedly asked the American embassy in Brazil to investigate, as Stuart was the son of an American citizen. Zuzu also established contact with several US congressmen, including the chair of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Sparkman. This eventually led to several congressmen pressuring the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to help the family find the answers that they were desperate for, even though there was evidence that the US State Department knew about Stuart's death. In a letter to Sparkman, Stuart's sister Anna Christina wrote, "No formal investigation of his alleged arrest and torture, or otherwise of his present whereabouts, was ever made in all these 4 years of painful uncertainty." Nevertheless, Zuzu's influence in the US helped raise awareness of her struggle to the American press and politicians, and also of the general trend of the disappearances of political oppositionists in Brazil. Not a single stone was left unturned in her 5-year campaign to put pressure on the Brazilian government. In 1974, she began working with Amnesty International to not only seek answers for the fate of her son, but to bring to light the similar human rights violations that were being committed on a daily basis. Not long after this, she also wrote to the Brazilian president Ernesto Geisel. In an even greater strike at the dictatorship, in 1975 she gave details of the case to a Brazilian historian that were published in a widely circulated book, ramping up the pressure even further. She said of her campaign, "I shall continue to knock on all doors to let the world know, through my fashions if necessary." All of this effort and incredible resilience coming from the heart of a desperate and heartbroken yet courageous mother who fought tirelessly to discover the truth about her son in the faint hope that perhaps, somehow, he may still be alive. But with the country now mired into the darkest years of the dictatorship, such challenges to the government would not be tolerated. Her campaign for answers and constant presence as a thorn in the government's side would lead her to the same fate as her beloved Stuart, becoming a target for the regime's brutality. By 1976, Zuzu Angel had exhausted an extraordinary amount of effort to learn the truth about her son. Her tenacious stance against the dictatorship had by now put her in a dangerous position, and she began to fear for her life, reporting to friends that she was being followed home at night and receiving death threats. In April of that year, she had left a letter at the house of her friend, composer Chico Buarque, saying, "If I turn up dead, by accident or other means, it will have been the work of my beloved son's murderers." A week later, on April 14th, just a month shy of the 5th anniversary of Stuart's disappearance, Zuzu Angel died in a car crash whilst on her way home, aged 55. Naturally, the death of a nationally known figure was sure to draw attention, and the cynical machinations of the dictatorship began immediately. The official version of her death leaned into the fact that the crash had taken place at 3 a.m, claiming it as an accident and that she had fallen asleep at the wheel. The Division of Security and Intelligence produced a report, drawing on interviews from her friends to emphasise that she had been very tired and had had a busy day with the television crew at her boutique. They also tried to highlight her allegedly declining mental state over her son's fate as a factor in her death. Almost immediately there was widespread suspicion over her death and the story put forward by the regime, but in a climate of repression, anybody making a concerted effort to challenge the government may well have faced the same fate as both Zuzu and her son Stuart. Calls to reveal the truth of Zuzu's death grew after the dictatorship came to an end in 1985, but truth would still be a long way away. In 1998, a Ministry of Justice commission into disappeared political activist voted 4-3 that her death had been politically motivated and engineered, rather than an accident as the official story claimed. In 2011, the demand for answers gained a new lease of life when Brazil set up the National Truth Commission. This was created to investigate human rights abuses in Brazil from the years 1946 to 1988, with the dictatorship era being a key focus of the commission's work. Documents that were declassified in 2014 confirmed Alex Polari's testimony that the security forces by the early 1970s preferred executions to imprisonment. It also confirmed the fact that these extensive practices of torture were well known to the Brazilian president Ernesto Geisel, who was in power at the time of Zuzu Angel's death. But also in 2014 came the single biggest breakthrough in the almost 40-year history of the case, one that her supporters had been searching for decades. In July of that year, a rarely seen photo of the scene of the apparent car accident came to light that was believed to show a man named Colonel Freddy Perdigão in the crowd gathered around the vehicle. Perdigão was an individual who had been actively involved in the torture and murder of political dissidents in 1970s Brazil, but had passed away in the 1990s. Interestingly, in the days that followed this revelation, other military figures from the era denied that it was Perdigão in the photo. This photo had been shared by another agent, Claudio Guerra. This new evidence led the National Truth Commission to believe that Perdigão had admitted to Guerra his participation in the planning and simulation of the accident that killed Zuzu Angel. However, details on the assassination itself, and exactly what happened in the dark and empty road tunnel where it took place, remain unknown. But regardless, a page had been turned. Almost 40 years on, insiders of the regime had finally confirmed once and for all the government's involvement in the assassination of an internationally renowned fashion designer and one of Brazil's most well-known public figures. The story of Zuzu Angel is one that lives on in the collective consciousness of modern-day Brazil. Schools, streets, and the tunnel where she died are all named after her, as well as there being a monument dedicated to her in Rio De Janeiro. In 2017, President Michel Temer signed a bill inscribing Zuzu Angel into the Book of Heroes and Heroines of the Motherland, ensuring her memory will live on among future generations of Brazilians. Her journey from internationally renowned fashion designer to a voice of justice in the face of tyranny was a remarkable one. Despite facing repression from the Brazilian media and regime at large, Zuzu's political protest fashion shows and relentless fight to find her son made her an icon among anti-dictatorship Brazilians. Her friend Buarque wrote a song about her the year after her death, Angelica. But the heart of her story was undoubtedly one of tragedy, a grieving mother who would do anything to find truth and closure of her beloved son, and who in the process recognised her power and responsibility to challenge the perpetrators of one of the darkest periods in Brazilian history. The exact details of what happened on the night of April the 14th, 1976 may never be fully uncovered. However, whilst the dictatorial regime has long since been consigned to the annals of history, its crimes of repression and the courage of people like Zuzu who raised their voices against it will never be forgotten. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.